I'm Alison McFarlane. I'm a professor here at the University of British Columbia, and I am director of the School of Public Policy and Global Affairs, which houses the Lind Initiative, which is what has brought you all here this evening. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that UBC is on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded lands of the Musqueam peoples. I'd like to pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and future. And since many of you are joining us this evening online, I'd like to invite you to reflect on the Indigenous lands that you're joining us from. A very warm welcome to all of you to our third event in the 2023 Phil Lind Initiative Speaker Series, Uncivil Discourse. Throughout this series, we invite public intellectuals and thought leaders to help us explore the intersections of language and political polarization in the United States. Through these conversations, we seek to raise questions as to if and how a civil culture can be reimagined in the current era. How can we have meaningful conversations with those who perceive the world from a much different vantage point from our own? And while our guests offer us windows onto the American experience, these conversations should and must also be had here in Canada. We're not immune to these challenges. We must also ask ourselves how to sustain respectful, honest, and deep conversations. We had the privilege of beginning this discussion with award-winning journalist Masha Gessen, who, in conversation with Carol Off, not only urged us to think of politics as the art of living together in a particular space, but also emphasized the importance of practicing this at the local level. Our second speaker, professor and critically acclaimed author Dr. John McWhorter, built on these foundations. In an excellent example of civil discourse, Dr. McWhorter and moderator Selena Caesar-Chavan discussed the promise and perils of narrowly focusing on this approach to societal change. I'm thrilled that tonight we get to continue this conversation. But before I introduce the moderator and tonight's keynote speaker, however, I want to acknowledge that we're able to gather here tonight because of the generosity of UBC alumnus Phil Lind, who has made not only this event, but all our previous programming possible. We can't thank Mr. Lind enough for giving us the opportunity to bring together such esteemed guests to UBC year after year to address our students, staff, faculty, and the broader community. So Phil, on behalf of myself as director of the School of Public Policy and Global Affairs, the Lind Initiative staff, the students, and extended UBC community, thank you for your contribution. On a logistical note tonight, please feel free to tweet along with the event using the hashtag Lind23. It's up there. And we'll be taking audience questions in the second part of the evening through Slido. Simply visit slido.com. There we go, up there, or use the QR code. And use the code hashtag LindSlido, all one word. Please feel free to submit your questions or to upvote a question you'd like to hear asked, but please don't put any comments. Our moderator this evening, whom you'll be meeting shortly, is Dr. Hugh Gusterson, a professor cross-appointed between the Department of Anthropology and the School of Public Policy and Global Affairs here at UBC. Dr. Gusterson has previously taught at MIT, George Mason University, George Washington University, the Georgia Institute of Technology, and was previously president of the American Ethnological Society. He's an award-winning author, has published widely in leading outlets across the United States, and is a columnist for the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists and Sapiens. I'd now like to introduce our keynote speaker for tonight, Dr. Safiya Noble. Dr. Noble is a 2021 MacArthur Fellow the Notable Genius Award, a recipient of the inaugural NAACP Archwell Digital Civil Rights Award, and author of the highly acclaimed book, Algorithms of Oppression: How Search Engines Reinforce Racism. She's professor of Gender Studies and African American Studies at the University of California, Los Angeles, where she serves as interim director of the UCLA DATX initiative. She and her work have been featured in Time Magazine, The Guardian, the BBC, CNN International, Wired, The New York Times, and among many others. I am really thrilled to have Dr. Safiya Noble here with us at UBC, and I'm going to turn the spotlight over to her now.
Hi. Hi, everyone. I love it. I love it. I love it. It's so wonderful to be here. I have to remember to shorten that bio every time that I come to speak somewhere because it's really embarrassing to hear. But thank you so much for that lovely introduction. I'm so grateful to all of the faculty and staff and students and, of course, the donors who have made this lecture here at UBC possible and who have made this day so wonderful. Thank you for staving off the snow for me because you know I came from Los Angeles and I am tender and I just can't anymore. I want to, first of all, also say that I am joining you from the unceded territory of the Tonga people who live in the area and are caretakers of the area, also known as Los Angeles. And I am grateful to be a guest here in this First Nations part of the world. And I know that as an African American, I also feel somewhat displaced in this world from these complicated histories that we're going to talk about tonight too. So let me just say that it was interesting to be invited to give a talk about uncivil discourse or civil discourse and polarization. And I'm going to try to really just blow up some of these notions tonight with you. So I just want to say that for people who come to hear me speak, that it is often, I mean, I'm glad that we did this later in the evening. My talks are followed best by an open bar or a situation where we can just go work it out because it's going to be tough conversation. But I am grateful that we're having these conversations, especially for those of us who live in the United States or for those of you who are from or are watching or invested in the US. We are just careening toward a next political milestone, the 2024 presidential election. And there's a lot on our minds, and there is a lot of conversation about politics and political discourse and the role of technology. So I'm going to try to share with you some of my work about kind of where I've been. I understand that many of the students here have been reading my work, reading my book, Algorithms of Oppression, and you did not need to read that as a prerequisite to come tonight. So I'm going to, for those of you who are not familiar with that work, I'm going to give you a little bit of a background on that, because it truly is how I came to this conversation that we're in tonight. And the whole night as well is not going to be a complete downer, because I am also going to try to talk about some liberatory possibilities for the future. And I think one of the things that's so amazing about speculating about our political futures is that we have to be kind of truth tellers about the moment that we're in and all the many set of possibilities that could come from it. So this book, Algorithms of Oppression, just turned 5 years old last month. I don't even know how that happened. It just seems like I wrote it yesterday, but here it's already turned 5 years old and people are still interested in hearing about it. So I say thank you. It is a book that at the time that it was written, when I started working on it in 2009, it was a time when words like algorithms were not part of our daily lexicon. We didn't use words like algorithm. In fact, I love to tell the story about my editor at NYU Press. When I told her I wanted to name this book Algorithms of Oppression, she was just like, absolutely not. no one knows what an algorithm is. And of course now, my mother-in-law is asking about the algorithm. I mean, everybody is in on the algorithms. And the algorithms and AI and the possibilities and the incredible marketing campaigns and billions of dollars that have been poured into our understanding of algorithms and AI is also part of the reason that we are here in these conversations about social media, technology, and its power, its role in the zeitgeist right now. So this book has kind of taken on a life of its own. It's become part of book clubs and all kinds of projects, creative projects. But really, this was one of the first books that interrogated the harmful consequences of something like a search engine in society for people that are often not thought about or prioritized in our society. So in this book, I looked at a variety of different kinds of search results that affected people that you would traditionally think of as marginalized or coming from histories of oppression. And, over the years, I have been writing about things like surveillance of Black communities or the role of social media in, used in kind of propagandistic ways against Black communities and Black people. And those are things that are boring. You can read about some other time. So one of the things that was really fundamental to this book that kind of it was the thing that I held up as symbolic of the types of practices that are happening in search engines was this early research on what happens when you do keyword searches on Black girls. And, there's been a lot of movement around these searches that I document in the book. I'm not going to show you all of those because I want to get to some other things. I'm just giving you kind of the highlight. But you can see here, I don't know if you probably can't see it very well here, but the search results for many years when you would search on Black girls or Latina girls or Asian girls, in a Google search engine would give you pornography. That was the primary way in which girls of color, which of course were women of color, because most of those porn sites allegedly had, women who were 18 years old and older there as the kind of subjects in those sites. And so women were just kind of fundamentally coded as girls, named like girls. But you didn't have to add the words porn and you didn't have to add the word sex to those results. We just were synonymous with pornography. And that was kind of the thread that I started with and started pulling on. And then, of course, uncovered many, many, many more deeply consequential kinds of search results that demonstrated a clear kind of a racist and sexist bias against women of color, against people of color, that are in the educational setting and in the kind of parent settings and all the different ways that I know people are using search engines. We're just kind of going undiscussed. People really weren't even giving a second thought to the kinds of things, the kinds of racist characterizations or sexist characterizations of people, because when people use search engines, they often find them to be incredibly reliable. And part of that's because if you're an American like me, you're trying to calculate like from Fahrenheit to Celsius, because we don't have any idea, right? You're trying to get into a metric situation, which we also know nothing about. So you need search for such banal kinds of inquiries that as you use search engines, as we use search engines more and more for the banal, we tend to then not question when we find results or when we're served up results that might be a little more complicated or troubling. And I think this is one of the things that I really tried to underscore in this book and spend time with. Now, part of what is so interesting to me about the way in which we think about, and we're hearing this discourse about technology right now in our society, is that social media, for example, in particular, is playing such a divisive role in politics around the world, right? In race relations around the world. And yet, we have very, very old ideas, hundreds of years old ideas about race, about gender, and about power, who should have it, who can be a human, who is not a human. If you look here, you can see some of these images dating back to like the 17th century. These kinds of representations of Black women and girls that are really about dehumanization. And these ideas of dehumanization didn't just show up on Facebook. They've been with us for a very long time. In fact, they get reinscribed into all kinds of new data projects. One of the things that has happened since the writing of that book is that there are also a handful of other very important books. I know I just said my book was very important, and that's not actually how I meant to say it, but there are other important books that I am fortunate to have my book stand alongside. Automating Inequality, Race After Technology, Invisible Women, Data Feminism. All of these books are more evidence about the way in which these kind of digital datafied projects are imbued with so many different kinds of troubling values, discriminatory values. And we now have a whole field of people who, let's say, broadly consider themselves working at the intersection of ethics or social justice or society and technology. So this is part of the complicated past that gets imbued into the kinds of projects that we are working with and living with right now. And I think it's important to understand that. Of course, everybody today, as I was coming through border control in the airport, the guard asked me, he's like, "What are you here for?" And I always am like struggling because I'm like, am I supposed to say that I'm here for a personal thing? If I say work, does that like trigger a different thing? So I would just like, I always get frozen every time I cross a border. And I said, well, I'm here tonight. I'm giving a lecture at UBC. And he's like, on what? I was like, I said, on the harms of AI to democracy. I was like, why did I say that? I'm definitely not crossing this border right now. And he goes, oh, yeah, that's like an education. It's really dangerous there. Like the AI writing papers. And I was like, okay, border control, get it. He was on top of it. He was ready. So, we are in this moment where people understand that there are like new stakes that are coming into view that we're going to have to contend with. But I think we have to remember that what we think of as kind of new concerns as being part of our complicated past or continuation of some of our complicated past. So here you have an image of running the Negro out of Tulsa, Oklahoma. And I think of images like this that are part of this history or this moment that we are living through of polarization, right? And I think it's so important that we pull out the frame when we talk about and when you are in conversations with your friends and your family and your colleagues, and there's a tendency to just kind of want to lean into these ideas that we're all of a sudden polarized, we're all of a sudden fractured, we're all of a sudden in these highly polemical, charged environments, that we actually have some language to unpack that. And so this is part of what I hope tonight's conversation will do. Now, here's one of the things that I want to show you about something like racial violence in the United States. Here's a site, blackpast.org, that has documented racial violence in the United States since 1526. And here's what I want you to see. This is a list, revolts of the enslaved. Antebellum urban violence, Civil War, Reconstruction, and post-Reconstruction era violence. You see these dates, 1868, 1871, 1873, 1875. Race riots, 1900, to 1960, 1910, 1917. Urban uprisings, 1960 to 2000. College campus violence, 21st century racial violence. So when we talk about polarization, we're going to have to actually talk about these kinds of histories. These were struggles over, were we human as Black people? Did we have the right to land? Did we have the right to live, to vote, to occupy a space, to have children, to vote, to be integrated into schools, colleges? So many struggles, to not be victims of sanctioned state violence, whether it was lynchings or violence at the hands of law enforcement. All of these kinds of struggles, social, political, economic struggles that we are in, are part of the environment that we flatten when we talk about polarization. And I think this is so important. We could look to LGBTQIA communities, the struggles for civil and human rights of LGBTQ, trans people, up until this very moment here in the United States and in other parts of the world, in Canada, I know, and all around the world, these struggles are political struggles. And I think it's really important that when we start talking about tonight in this conversation about something like political polarization, what that portends is that there was some imagined past where we were unified, where we were fine, where we were solid, where there was no contention over our humanities, where there was no contention over human or civil or sovereign rights. And so these, to me, are really so important that we just bring these into the conversation tonight. Now, is it possible that with all of the technology that is without a doubt playing a role in the amplification and quite frankly, in these struggles over civil, human, sovereign rights, is actually using those political power struggles over the kind of recognition of humanity, the recognition of the ability to participate in society, or the contraction and foreclosing upon the possibility of people to participate in society. The sector, generally speaking, profits handsomely from these contestations. It actually, in fact, uses so many of these struggles for rights as clickbait in its projects. And I think this is so important. So here we have, Facebook. I mean, I almost feel bored just bringing up that Facebook is terrible. I mean, can I just say that and we just move on? I think that, what we know is that these ideas about its role in things like human rights violations, in human trafficking, in facilitating the collapse of Western liberal democracies, in its role in bolstering authoritarian governments around the world. I mean, we have a lot of evidence now about Facebook's role in that and their products. In fact, the groups like the Real Facebook Oversight Board, of which I am one of the members, we've issued many statements about the kind of whitewashing of human rights and other kinds of rights, and have tried to play a role in seeing court cases litigated around these incredible devastations that have happened around the world. And so I think we are now in a moment, unlike the conversations and the work that brought me to thinking about the role of technology in society, the role of misrepresentation in something like a search engine or other Google products, and not just Google's products either, to be certain. But now, what does it mean that we are in a moment where we are truly seeing communities respond to these aggressions? And I think that's also really important, because when we think about the framing of something like polarization or public discourse around politics, we really flatten so many concepts, and we think of those things as like me against you, or you against your brother-in-law, or these kinds of fractures that certainly are happening in our families. I would guess that very few people are not experiencing, at least at a minimum, seeing somebody from high school that you just really wish you didn't know what they thought about things, right? Somewhere in a feed. So we see now that kind of this is the framing about like the public, but truly the polarization activity, the profiting from these flattened conversations, is actually between the tech sector and publics around the world. And that, to me, is a much more interesting way of thinking about what does it mean for us as publics to take on an industry and a set of challenges. So I've been working on this, thinking future, toward the future. What does it look like to take on something like big tech at a time when it just seems so normal and comfortable and easy and like we can't live without it? And so I want to remind us, and I gave a more extensive talk on just this part, if you want to watch it sometime. But, there was a time in the United States and throughout the Americas where there was such a normalization of big cotton and big agriculture that was completely dependent upon not only the occupation of indigenous lands, but also the transatlantic slave trade and the enslavement of millions of people. And the normalization was so deep that it took more than 200 years to abolish those practices. Now, you have to imagine what that's like. It's kind of like when my students say, well, Dr. Noble, I can't participate in my classes or my job or social life without technology. And I think back to what the times must have been like when people thought they couldn't live their lives without enslaved people doing aspects of the work for their families or the economy. Like, really couldn't imagine it. And those kinds of the lack of imaginary or the perceived value and benefit are part of the kinds of things that we need to be disrupting and we need to be thinking about. And so this idea of what did it take to shift a paradigm from the era of big cotton to such that we would not imagine that to be a normalized practice around us. The same is true for big tobacco. I don't have a pen here with me, but I will tell you, sometimes I pull a pen out of my bag and I smoke it for my students, and I tell them that I'm sure the doctor that delivered me was smoking a cigarette, had a cigarette hanging. I know for a fact my mom chain smoked 2 packs of cigarette after she gave birth to me in the hospital. And the students, they can't believe it, but everybody here that's my age or older absolutely knows what I'm talking about. And we could not imagine that we would have the kind of paradigm shift around big tobacco that we have had. And yet here we are living in a time where we are differently oriented to big tobacco than the way we were 50 years ago. And for sure, many of the same kinds of arguments that were made around big cotton and big tobacco, like that our economies depend upon these industries, that we could not imagine ways of life without them. Really, it was people who were not only abolitionists, but people of conscience who said we have to imagine some alternate paradigm to this. We have to. And of course, I'm always excited to study the history of social movements because one of the things that, I learned from my mom, she would say, baby, everybody said that they marched with Dr. King nobody was marching with Dr. King. You know what I mean? Like, it was 10% of the community that was really out there in the streets. And many other people were helping in the civil rights movement in a lot of quiet and silent, unseen ways. But what that tells me is that we don't need 100% participation. We actually need to find our 10% of the people who are willing to do this work. And I feel really excited about that. Of course, search companies, I'm going to just say, I should have just had a slide that said ChatGPT on it, because that's all anybody wants to talk about right now. So we can talk about that as we kind of unfold. But certainly new technologies are posing real threats to democracy, but they're also forcing new conversations about what is democracy. And I think that also is very exciting, because there are many people around the world for whom they have lived under the burgeoning projects of democracy, but have not been included in the democratic project, and have certainly not benefited from the largesse of what democracy has promised. And so these threats also create a new opportunity for us to reimagine the future of concepts like democracy. So here are some people that I think you should also know about, who are also thinking in these kind of nuanced ways about people and communities. These ideas about what we stand to gain and lose at the intersection of race and technology and society are really incredible. There's a whole slew. We're just outside of Black History Month, but I'm gonna just lean back into February and tell you that these are some incredible Black scholars who you need to know about. And you can find all of us at the kind of critical race and digital studies.com website. And there are also, when I think about the possibility for libertarian futures, there are people who are working so hard now to help us reframe and expand upon the dominant narratives that really dominate even the space of critique about the tech sector. So here I'm thinking about not just kind of my center, the Center for Race and Digital, or the Race and Digital Studies that's out of NYU, and many of us are parts of it, but the Distributed AI Research Network, which is an incredible research network that's headed by Dr. Timnit Gebru, the former head of AI and ethics at Google, who many of you may remember was fired for doing her job of pointing out Google's unethical products that were in development. People like Joy Buolamwini and the Algorithmic Justice League. And I just have to, because today is the 5-year anniversary of the gender shade study that both Joy Buolamwini and Timnit Gebru launched into the world, that has truly changed the world. I want to acknowledge that, because here were 2 Black women doing a study that showed how facial recognition technologies did not work on Black people's faces, and especially on Black women's faces, and that there would be dire consequences for the public if these kind of off-the-shelf technologies were adopted by law enforcement and immigration and airlines and all kinds of industries that are taking them on. And they proved that there was so little kind of efficacy for darker skinned people with facial recognition technology that that work is really monumental. And part of what is so exciting to me as I look out and at our fields is, I go back to here, so many of these thinkers and scholars, our work was kind of derided a decade ago, and now it's at the forefront of really helping people understand the incredible consequences. So I think the last thing I want to kind of leave us with as a thing to think about as we go into our conversation tonight is that this, to me, was one of the kind of most important takeaways of this book, Algorithms of Oppression, which is this idea that we have more data and technology than ever. And, we had a promise that the more data and the more tech we had, the more democracy we'd have, the more participation, the more inclusion. But what we actually have is more social, political, and economic inequality. In fact, every year that we study wealth inequality, economic inequality in the world, every year we are more unequal than the year before. In fact, 2 years ago, the UK House of Lords published a study, and they said that they predicted that by 2030, the top 1% would own 2/3 of the world's wealth. 1% would own 2/3 of the world's wealth. And I think this is so interesting and important. In fact, I argue everywhere I go that the kind of datafication that is happening in our society, the new kinds of ungovernable AI and digital technology that's coming into the marketplace is probably going to be the most important human rights issue of the 21st century. And I say that really convicted because we are moving kind of through and past this era for the need for representation. So much of my own lifetime has been about struggles for visibility and representation in politics, in media, in Hollywood, in school, in education, in so many forms of institutional power in society. But now we are moving into an era, I think, of a kind of an age of classification, where as much information as possible is being collected about us in order to sort us in and out of opportunities. I told you that this talk needed to be followed by an open bar. I did say that, right? So I just want to make sure that full disclosure, that this is a hard conversation. But to me, what it presents is such an opportunity for us to look for points of refusal. And this, I was talking with some students here earlier today about, the things that I see with kind of younger students now, just the difference in 10 years of students in the classroom, and younger students today who are refusing social media or refusing to be ensnared into different types of surveillance systems, or who are seeking actively that refusal. And I think that's so important for those of us who are educators, people working in universities, working in government, working in institutions. We have very hard questions and decisions to make about, will we deepen investments in technology, or will we deepen investments in people? And of course, this is one of the interesting conversations that we're having at UCLA that I'll close on and just say, when I think about the question of the future of these kinds of technologies that are coming into our space, like ChatGPT, the question is not, will this break education? I think the more interesting question is, will we respond with deeper investments in technologies to police students, deeper investments in trying to figure out how to control with more technology the kinds of things that are happening in the space? Or will we say, we are refusing that kind of engagement? We don't venerate it. We don't put it on a pedestal and think that it is better than human beings thinking. Now, this is it feels very controversial to say, because we are living right now in a moment where the tech industry is narrating to us that AI could be sentient one day, where reporters are talking about the kind of anthropomorphic ways that they're engaging with AI, and that it's disturbing, and that it feels like a bad actor, which, of course, because it's trained on all kinds of terrible things called the internet. But also, we have to reject these ideas that these technologies are somehow better than humans, that they make better decisions than humans, that they will be more relevant than humans. I always found it so interesting, I wrote about this in the book, that at the very moment in US history where we had the passage of the Civil Rights Act in 1964, that gave the first real meaningful opportunity for people of color and for women to participate in decision-making in government, in corporations, in education, to emerge into management, into leadership positions in our institutions. That was also the moment that really kind of gave rise to this idea that responded to the civil rights movement with ideas that computers can make better decisions than human beings. And so we have to ask ourselves, like, if we're going to talk about these ideas about the alleged civility, which again, I trouble this notion that there was some previous more civil moment that we are yearning for. I showed you the list. The question to me is really much more how can we make more visible the consolidation of power among a handful of people and companies who then obfuscate that power in every way possible through the gamification of technology, and then turn around and narrate that to us that we are the problem, that we can't get along, that we are the people polarized. I think that's worth double clicking on, and so I think I'll leave it there and let's open up a conversation. Thank you.
Here we go. Thanks, Safiya. Those remarks were wonderful, very stimulating. It's an honor to have you here at UBC.
Thank you.
And it's a privilege to be in conversation with you.
Same.
I was struck by the way, don't forget about Slido. If you have questions, please be putting them in Slido. I was struck, just to begin with a bit of trivia, your story about your editor and my editor were alter egos. In 2018, I published a book called Life by Algorithms, and the title was originally going to be Robo-Humans, and my editor said, oh my God, what an awful title. You know, it has to have the word algorithm in it. The only way you're going to make people buy this edited volume is if you have the word algorithm in it. So.
You're welcome. I was arguing for that in 2012. And yeah, I remember that conversation was so great because it was like, that's a no-go. And here we are. You got algorithms to live by and all the things. And we're not even really about the algorithms now, are we? We're pretty far past that.
Well, I did want to ask a question about the algorithms to begin with. So one of the things I realized reading your book is how much we take things like search engines for granted as sort of part of our mental furniture.
Yes.
And it's almost like they're a pair of glasses through which you look at the world. And why would you be interested in a pair of glasses? They're just something you look through. You're interested in the world out there. And that's the way we think of search engines and Facebook and stuff like that. There's something you look through rather than at. And one of the many virtues of your book, I think, is that it says, no, wait a minute, just slow down here and look at it. Don't just look through it. So it's very educational for me to read in that respect. And it made me wonder, how would we have more digital literacy with high school students, university students, the general population? How could we teach people to think more critically about looking at search engines rather than taking them for granted? So how can we have a populace that's more digitally literate? I have a 15-year-old daughter, and I would like her to think more about these things.
I get it. I have an 11-year-old too, and a 27-year-old, and so I really have also struggled for many years with this. You know, I think, of course, we should be investing, publics should be investing, school districts, municipalities in digital literacy, critical digital literacy in particular. And by critical, I mean just having a power analysis, being able to recognize like there are more powerful players than others, or these are embedded in a context of society and uneven histories of just total inequity. And that's very important because and that's one of the things I try to do in the book is not just say like, oh, the search engine bad. It's more like much more harmful for people who are more vulnerable. We should be thinking about that. Now, of course, we need that kind of literacy, but I struggle and I try not to foreground that very much in my own work because even though I support it, because I think, again, that puts the onus back on the people to know better. It's just a framing that lacks the real focal point of where we should put our energy, to me. We don't ask the question, why do we get served at this? Why is Google the IT backbone for colleges and universities now and high schools, right? And we really saw this during COVID when the tech sector was the sector that made more money than any other industry. I mean, they were just making money hand over fist because we didn't really think critically about what type of investment we should be making. I mean, imagine if that kind of financial investment had been made into teachers and other kinds of creative strategies to continue education, rather than, more Slack, more apps, more Chromebooks, all the things. So I think that is, to me, part of the critical media literacy or the critical tech literacy is figuring out why we respond with a technical solution. First of all, why we think that the technical has the answers. I mean, these systems are such coarse, they're coarse databases. They are not refined. They are not precise. I try to really show that in the book so that we understand that we're really seeding far too much. And then when the tech sector narrates back to us, well, we should know better, I just feel like that's a disingenuous proposition. So yes, we need to teach our kids what they're dealing with. I mean, you can imagine what it's like for my kids with me as their mom. They're like, this is what did I do to deserve this? I mean, my son is like, can't you just be a normal mom? And I'm like, no, I can't. And your friends, they're gonna wish that I was their mom, trust me, because I'm trying to help you not get caught up in these systems.
So what advice do you have for parents?
Well, my advice for parents is the, advice that we try to experiment with, which is we are constantly interrogating the device. We don't treat the device, especially for our son, as private. It's not private because Google and like Apple and everybody else can see what you're texting and what you're doing, but your parents can't. Like, how's that make sense? So we try to say, like, nothing we do on these things are private. That already is like alarming. I mean, when COVID hit and the school gave the Chromebook, I of course gave the lesson on, now here's how the Chromebook works. And here's how Google Classroom works. Every time you're logged in and then you and your friends think you're gonna open up a chat and goof off and kiki on the side, your teachers can see that. So then he's like, wait, what? This is terrible. Like, this is so unfair. And I was like, isn't it? So like, that's how we do it. And we try to keep it light and fun and scary in our house. That's what we're doing.
There is the perennial question, at what age should a kid get a smartphone? Your answer?
At the age that you can no longer keep from giving it to them. I mean, I don't know. Like, that's, and yeah,
I know that.
It's hard. It's really hard. I also, one of the things we try to do is not treat it like a digital leash. So we also, as parents, my husband and I try to, let him go and have fun. And, I'm always with my husband, I'm like, remember when we used to have like a dime or a quarter? And, our parents just got a call when we felt like calling to let them know we were alive, And he's like, yeah, but I hated that. Like, I don't want to be on that side of that. And I'm like, I know. And I'm like, but, crime is statistically down versus the 70s. Like, I try to do all these mind games for us so that we can also not, overmanage and undermine our kids' independence. And I will tell you, I had a student once, and it broke my heart. She was a student from New York, and she was one of the best students I have ever taught. I kid you not. She was just brilliant. And she said, Dr. Noble, I can't go anywhere in LA, and my parents don't know. And if I go to the mall, my mom is texting me, and she's like, why are you at the mall, and why aren't you studying? This was a grown woman in college whose parents were surveilling her through her device. because they were so worried about her. And I just thought, oh my gosh, if I could just tell those parents, your daughter is so on point, you really don't need to be worried. But, you know, we have work to do too, not just the kids. And that's really important. You got to kind of put the mirror up to ourselves.
So just one more question on digital literacy. Part of learning a judicious use of algorithms and search engines and so on is knowing not just what they're bad for, all the ways they're dangerous, but also appreciating what they're good for, the shortcuts they enable you to take that are maybe good shortcuts, not bad shortcuts, like ChatGPT. I'm
Are you
told
saying it's a good shortcut or a bad shortcut?
that's a bad one.
Okay, I'm just checking.
But we'll get to that.
Okay.
We'll get to that. But I'm told by people in the medical profession, for example, that there are things that medical algorithms may be better at than human doctors, reading x-rays and things like that. I noticed that when I go to my doctor now, he often doesn't look at me and my body, he looks at his laptop, and the algorithm is clearly saying, okay, this is the next question that you ask. Are we getting better medical care because of algorithms like that? Are there things that we should be grateful to algorithms for?
I think you probably are. And by that I mean,
Because I'm in Canada.
okay, that's not what I meant, but that too. I think that we know these medical algorithms are also trained on medical data. And most clinical trials and other types of medical data we know is mostly run on middle-class white men. So whoever did that, I cannot see the audience because of the lights, but I'm here for you. So we know that. We know that the same is with pharmaceutical trials and drug trials. And so that means that the level of dependence that doctors have on medical algorithms that are not trained on the diversity of the population, especially on women, especially on Black women and Indigenous women, means that probably the wrong questions are being asked generally and generalized to everyone. And these are why we still have incredibly, we have medical apartheid in terms of the way in which medicine is practiced and in still racially and kind of gender discriminatory ways, and especially if you start talking about LGBTQ and trans people. So I think that, it's as Cathy O'Neil says in her book, Weapons of Math Destruction, these predictive algorithms are making things better for people who've already got it good and worse for people who are already on the short end of so many processes, and I think she's right.
So to shift gears a little bit, the US Supreme Court last week heard this fascinating case where a couple whose adult kid had been killed in a terrorist attack attributed this to Google's search algorithm, saying that Google had provided a platform for terrorist propaganda and had pushed the propaganda up through the algorithm. And the Supreme Court was looking at the possibility that it might have the authority to order search engines to stop using algorithms. And they seemed pretty frightened. It was like an abyss that they were staring into. I'm wondering if you have an opinion, if they asked your opinion, what they should decide?
Why aren't they asking my opinion?
Yeah, well, I'm asking.
I know. Okay,
We'll
all right.
relay it to
We'll
them.
send it to them.
We'll email it to them. I don't know their email account, but we'll find out.
Yeah, that's fine. We'll get it.
We'll email it to them.
Yes, all
And
right.
so Section 230, I guess it is, from
Yeah.
1996, all 26 words of it,
Yeah.
says that Google is free to mess with your news feed as it wants to. So what do you think the Supreme Court should do? And if they were to rule algorithms out and repeal Section 230, I imagine life would be kind of different, huh?
It would be so different. I mean, it's really, I think to people in the tech sector, it is a radical idea that algorithms could be outlawed, or predictive algorithms in the case of trying to figure out who you are and then serve up different kinds of things to you. It would not really be that radical of an idea, because whoever even gave Google or YouTube or Facebook permission to collect all this information about us and then target us. So like that actually is presupposition that needs to be interrogated. I don't think, yes, people consented because they scrolled the terms and conditions and checked the box so they could join Facebook or they could join, sign into YouTube or get Gmail. But this is really an important case, and it's important, these conversations about shifting policy, especially Section 230, and trying to figure out whether platforms will be held accountable as publishers, because we could see, there is a future where to collect data on us at the level and the intensity by which that's happening right now, and then micro-targeting or even aggregating it, which is really more so what's happening. They're looking for, like the women who were snapping for me, like we're in a group to Google, and like aggregating people with like interests or ideas to sell products to them. That's really what the point is. That could be incredibly transformative. And not only that, could help open up a way that we could completely reimagine the internet from being a totalizing surveillance system to maybe something really different. And so to me, of course, I'm always interested in the conversations about repealing 230 or adjudicating it differently. And I think, there are I'm not a lawyer, I just pretend to be one, but I wish I were a lawyer, because the lawyers, I'm watching people like the Cyber Civil Rights Initiative, I'm watching legal scholars like Danielle Citron, Marianne Franks. These are the people that Frank Pasquale, Julia Powell's, I'm watching them because I think they have some very good ideas. I'm also watching the Federal Trade Commission in relationship to some of what's happening with SCOTUS, because that's the Supreme Court of the United States, because they also have the ability to really influence things like, do algorithms violate our civil rights? And if so, there can be sanctions, and that's really important. Of course, the White House just issued an executive order that technologies cannot violate our civil rights. So this really gets at, what do these companies have about us that then could be used to violate our civil rights, and how do we reduce their ability to have that? And that seems like a really exciting way forward, rather than more of the same that we have today.
And now I warned you I was going to ask you a question about this very Canadian thing.
You did.
So that you could study up.
Canadian law to be here tonight.
So there is a bill wending its way through Parliament in Ottawa, C-18,
Yes.
that would force Google to pay news organizations if it directed people to their content and
Yeah.
it was accessed. I guess Australia already passed a law like this.
They did.
To my knowledge, they're the only country that has a law like that. Google says it's experimenting this week by cutting off the access of 4% of Canadians to Google. I'm not quite sure what the point of that experiment is. Maybe it's a signal to the Trudeau
Like
government.
a flex more than an experiment.
If this passed, would it change anything very much?
Well, I was not a big fan of this when it was kind of being discussed in Australia, because on the face of it, this law basically, at least in that context, and I think here in this context, is about the way in which Google kind of aggregates news. And, we see our news either through Google or its products or through search, but all of the advertising revenue gets collected at the level of Google, and it doesn't make it down into the newsrooms and the news environments that desperately need that money. And of course, we've seen a total collapse of journalism over the last 30 years. So this is incredibly important. These resources are dire. And yet, I think in the Canadian bill, it was something that it was under $300 million that I think was going to go back to. It was like 200 and something million dollars that was going to go back into Canadian journalist outfits. And I thought to myself, well, that's like the pocket lent in Sundar Pichai's pocket. He's the CEO of Google. So like that is not again, the frame does not interrogate, should Google even be able to own the news to the degree that it does and control the news environment to the degree that it does. Instead, it's like peeling off a little piece of lint for the organizations. And so I guess I feel like it's a structural issue that we need to interrogate more. Of course, I want the journalists to get money. I want all the money to go back to public institutions and democratic institutions. So I'm not against these reparative kinds of moves, but I think they need to be bigger, much bigger. What we actually need to see is billions of dollars transferred from Google and YouTube back into a whole host of organizations and institutions that have been harmed by its work and its products. And so, you know, it's reparative, but it needs to be bigger and a larger scale. And we need to interrogate whether, like, you know, whether these models should work this way. I remember once saying to people at Facebook, you know, they were talking about the news because Facebook has this same kind of issue where it, you know, everybody goes to Facebook and watches the news. Everybody over like 35, 40. And I remember once saying to a Facebook executive, why don't you just give the news back to journalists? Just get out of the news business. Don't show news feeds on Facebook. And it was like it was incomprehensible to them. They couldn't imagine like giving the news back to newsmakers. So as long as you have the journalists also having to be mediated by Google, YouTube, you know, a whole host of platforms, then they also get ensnared into these kinds of like clickbait regimes, you know, advertising regimes in order to get their work to be made visible. So it's really, it's like, you know, that's what I think.
I will say
not what we want, ideally.
I will say this is the only positive thing you'll ever hear me say about Facebook. You know, I have a group of friends on Facebook who are busy being human news crawlers for me. And, you know, the things I'm interested in, like drone warfare and the nuclear arms race that most people aren't interested in, they're busy finding them for me and posting them. And I wouldn't come across these obscure news stories from journals and magazines that I don't read without them. So
you know who used to do that in the days of the early internet? The librarians.
Yeah.
Shout out to my librarian friends. So, right? I mean, there is kind of a model where we could think back. I mean, I don't think of the early days of the internet as being the glory days either. I really don't. I try not to romance the past, but I think that this idea of like subjective subject matter expertise, like what a reference librarian does, what a DIY expert does, what a hobbyist does, really reframes like what we know we're seeing, because we're like, oh, like that's my friend who like is just finding things. We know the subjective nature of that. That's really different when you go and Google it and it just comes up as a top hit and you're like, that must be the truth.
Well, that's the difference between Google and Facebook.
Yeah.
You know, I have friends in India who read things I would never read, and they find an article about Indian nuclear weapons and they message it to me or they put it in their feed, and so I get to see it, which a librarian wouldn't do and Google wouldn't do.
Yeah.
So I'm going to go to the real dark, the really intensely dark side now.
Oh my gosh, I thought we were already there. Okay.
You have a UCLA colleague, Jeff Brentingham, who developed this algorithm, PredPol, predictive policing. I mean, step backwards a little bit. The United States is in a situation of mass incarceration of people of color, especially black people, over-policing of black neighborhoods, killing of black people by police in incredible numbers, right? This algorithm tells the police, these are the black neighborhoods that you want to saturate with police. And there are judges now who use predictive algorithms to decide whether someone is likely to be a recidivist or not, how long a jail sentence they should get, whether they should get probation or not. Could you talk about the way these fit into the crisis of mass incarceration and police violence against the Black community in the United States?
Sure. I mean, there's a lot of people working on a lot of different things at UCLA. What's interesting about my colleagues who work on a project like that is that they have, 100 times the funding of those of us who are working against it. So that's one of the fundamental challenges in academics who are also kind of richly rewarded with lots of funding from everything from like the NSF to state and local governments to develop these kinds of projects, and that, we don't have the corollary going into the interrogation. There have been, though, a number of UCLA faculty who have responded to UCLA's participation in these technologies in that way. So I think, what's distressing is that PredPol and recidivism prediction software, criminal sentencing software, probation and other types of software, what they're doing is they're kind of using historical data sets about where arrests have been taken place in a city and using that as the data to feed into a model to help predict where future crime will happen. So just so people can kind of get in on this conversation, what is it? If you have communities like in Los Angeles, we are an incredibly racially and economically segregated city. We have had racist real estate covenants that were in existence, and we have gentrification and all kinds of redlining and different types of insurance and financial products and projects that have contributed to having an incredibly segregated city and maintaining that. And so if you go to certain pockets of the city, and this could be any city, and you over-police poor people, which are overwhelmingly Black and Latino in Los Angeles, and you have high numbers of arrests, that's not, of course, a measure of whether people have committed crimes. They're just arrests. And then you have poor people who are more likely to be, in fact, found guilty because they aren't going to have representation, or they're going to have to plea out just so they can get out and go back to work or take care of their kids, or all the things, all the reasons why people will take a plea because they just have to get back to life. You have all these different kinds of forces, and then you take that and you turn that into data and you feed it into a predictive model. That model is going to tell you to go right back to those places because that's where all of the arrests have taken place before. And so this is fundamentally one of the most dangerous kinds of predictive technologies, that it really is a matter of life and death for people all over the country. And outside of the United States, the kind of use of these kinds of technologies are being used to predict who should and should not cross borders. One of the reasons why I made a mistake in telling the border crossing guy what I was here for. So I think the types of data that get collected and fed into these processes and these projects are incredibly dangerous. Add to that things like law enforcement and Homeland Security pulling in, let's say, massive mugshot databases. Now, if you're arrested, you're likely to have a mugshot taken of you, right? And if you're X factor more likely to be arrested, then more people of color are also going to be in these databases. And those get used to train facial recognition models. And so now we have a situation where we have, not just coupled with these kind of predictive policing algorithms, we couple that with facial recognition, and now we see law enforcement in Los Angeles and other places using technology to help them just scan a room and look for any facial recognition match of anyone who, let's say, might have a warrant out or maybe is a person of interest. So this actually changes the whole nature of policing, and it's terrifying to me to think about how many people I know, who have been arrested or wrongfully detained or messed with by the police, pulled over and harassed. All of these people being Black people, family members, people I love, people I know, my students, my colleagues. And how will we find our way out of these things, right? So this is where, when you see things in your community like hearings on whether to ban facial recognition by law enforcement, and that's being debated at the city council, you have to show up and fight to ban it. You have to, because these things are really tied. And what we're seeing ultimately is so many ways in which we are being sucked into different types of predictive systems that will then over-determine what's possible for our future, right? And so it's just interesting because in the U.S., the politicians really like to vilify things like social credit and like credits, like not like these scoring systems that are in China. Social credit scoring systems in China about opportunity or not. But those are predicated upon the things we are doing in the United States, from credit scoring to all these other kinds of things we're talking about. We're the model. We're the place where the modeling is happening. And you can be guaranteed that those models that get tried out on women of color who live in Skid Row in Los Angeles, who have these kinds of predictive models used to take away their children from them, which Victoria Copeland did an amazing study with Stop LAPD Spying Coalition, an incredible organization that we've learned so much from about this. It's really important that we understand that poor people of color, especially women of color, are the beta testers for these, and our children are the people upon whom these things are being beta tested. But you can be guaranteed that once they are perfected, they will be generalized to the entire population.
So I hadn't realized myself quite how algorithmized and sort of technologized policing had become till I was in this 10-week class where all the other students were cops except me. And I was toying with the idea of writing a detective novel at that moment in my life. And so I thought, okay, well, I've got detectives and cops all around me. I'll ask their advice. And so I was imagining a Sherlock Holmes or Miss Marple character who would interview people and would see through them and would catch them out in the contradictions in their stories. And they said, no. You bring this device in and it scans the crime scene. And then, it tells you what to look for. And everything was about technology. I mean, many of these cops just had high school qualifications. They hadn't been to college. But they were way ahead of me in the technology. And for them, the technology would be the main actor. In the novel, that's how you would solve a murder, is through polygraphs and DNA analysis, blood spatter analysis and stuff like that.
Yeah, but look at how even DNA testing has, that's a practice that has really evolved over decades, and its reliability or lack of reliability. And again, I think it's really interesting. Part of this is that these are science projects. These are science questions that a lot of people are interested in. Not unlike the Manhattan Project or like Oppenheimer, these are people who thought of these innovations as really interesting science projects. But the deployment, of course, of those projects is incredibly uneven, and it's incredibly political. And even the project that we think of it called the internet was really, this is where, being kind of an library and information science nerd, learning about these kind of precursors to the modern day internet that we have, and understanding them as being intranets for scientists to sequester scientific knowledge away from, at that time, what was considered the third world, or the non-aligned movement, right? These were projects to ensure that the empires could not let the colonies have scientific knowledge, and to foil their liberation movements, to try and overthrow colonization. So these histories are also under-narrated, but very important too, in the kind of the role of scientists and science in that.
So let's go to the audience.
Let's do it.
they've been waiting very patiently, and we have some
you.
great questions coming in on Slido. So I see the most popular question to ask you.
Capricorn.
Upvoted the most.
Is that the one? Is that the one you wanted? That's not the one you wanted? Okay.
Technology moves faster than our ability to understand it, let alone legislate. Given also the size and power and funding of big tech, how can we begin to be proactive and not reactive?
Well, I think there have been a number of scholars over the last 2 decades who have been very proactive and probably less heard or recognized. So, I do want people to know that as new things emerge, there are a lot of people that are looking, especially scholars. I mean, I find that, at least in my field of kind of critical internet and technology scholars, we're watching a lot of things, not just to be reactive, but when things are kind of in development. I think for the public, it's a little bit of a different situation, because by the time the public engages with something like ChatGPT, they didn't even know that it was being developed for all these years. Where I remember the first time I learned about OpenAI and ChatGPT, I'm going to say it was like the fall of 2019. And I mean, it was like, I was sick, because I was like, this is going to be horrible. So, I think we have to figure out, one, we need to really fund more researchers who are in positions to kind of elevate awareness about the kinds of things that are being developed. And those are oftentimes social scientists and humanists who we are looking at these projects differently and trying to talk about them. So that is one lever of intervention. I think we need probably agencies around the world who are invested in consumer safety. Period. Like, I think these are consumer safety issues. We would never let 3 guys go into a strip mall and like cook up some drugs and roll it out. What's the big drugstore in Canada? For us, it's Walgreens or CVS. I don't know. It's like Shoppers. We'd never just let it out in Shoppers on the weekend. And then when everyone's sick or hurt, say like, it's just chemistry, you guys. That's your fault. You didn't have to buy it. We would never do that. We wouldn't bring that paradigm. But that's the paradigm, because when the Compass recidivism prediction software was developed, it was 3 guys in a strip mall who like cooked up this algorithm and then sold it to municipalities. And investigative journalists, Julia Angwin and her team, discovered like the problems and researched it. So that's the reactive part, is because there's no oversight on these products entering the marketplace, and we don't have the right frame on it. We frame it like it's technology, like it's ephemeral, like it's, I mean, the industry is so brilliant. They're like, it's in a cloud. In a cloud, so like these metaphors that are invoked make it seem like it's inevitable, it's natural, it's part of nature, it's a reliable part of the ecosystem we can understand, instead of, you can't actually put a product out into the marketplace until you've proven every which way to Sunday that it's safe.
So let's see how many of these Slido questions we can squeeze in 9 minutes.
I know, my answers are too long.
And I have a feeling, actually, your answer to this one might be very short. What is the best thing algorithms have done for the world?
That is not actually an easy question. It might be short because I don't have an answer.
Well, I thought you might say they haven't done anything good.
Say what?
They haven't done anything good.
It's probably not true. I think, honestly, the place where I see predictive modeling through algorithms being helpful is around climate change and understanding climate change better. To me, I think that's like a place where we could say maybe there's something there. Now, it has also happened in tandem with climate activists, especially climate refugee activists, who have been, and these are people of color, primarily from outside of the United States, and indigenous peoples who have brought to bear really important knowledge about what climate change is doing to like have their islands disappear or make it impossible for their peoples to live in the lands that they've occupied for tens of thousands or more years. So if you know, the climate scientists weren't really looking at that. They look at different kinds of things. And if you couple what people know about what's really happening with those kinds of forecasting and modeling, then I think there's something very interesting. Like we should be anticipating, those of us who live in California, we should be anticipating that we will be climate refugees at some point ourselves from the fires and the floods and the things, the earthquakes. So we should be planning. I think everybody's planning to go to Vermont. I'm not really sure, but I heard that that's the place to go.
Don't come to Canada.
We're coming to Vancouver. I'm coming to Vancouver.
So we have a question here, maybe from a computer science major or even faculty member.
Okay.
What can computer science faculty members do in their curriculum in training computer science students
Besides teaching my book.
Yeah.
Because I feel like that's a given. All right. So I think that one of the things we're trying to do at UCLA is teach together more with computer scientists, humanists, social scientists, and complicate the questions around the kind of fundamental questions that happen in computer science courses, and also reveal the kinds of questions we would ask in social sciences and humanities about data and technology, and revealing and making the data science and computer science more visible or accessible. So those things are very important. I know many of my like math and statistics colleagues at UCLA, for example, you know how we are. We're like PhD nerds in our thing. So it's unfair, I think, to ask the computer scientists to go and become social scientists or sociologists and really understand, have a deep knowledge. I mean, I've spent a long time on these, talking about, thinking about, researching these things. So I think working together is very important, teaching together.
Should they have mandatory ethics courses, or is that window dressing?
I mean, I feel like ethics, the way I have seen some computer scientists in the United States want to teach ethics and computer science, is they're like reaching back for like Aristotle or like John Locke or something. I'm like, wait, what? So that's not it. So I think that's not it. And it's better to have this incredible, we have dozens and dozens, hundreds now, maybe thousands if we count articles and book chapters that are really good social science and humanities work about technology, and that should be taught as a framework for thinking about issues like justice, using words like oppression. I think ethics has been co-opted and captured by industry. I mean, when Google set up its own ethical AI division, I was like, ethics is over. So, I think ethics, the ethics washing is very powerful right now in the tech sector. So ethics is not, I think we need to get the other words that come out of our kind of critical studies and critical theories.
We have a question here. How could we disrupt the for-profit model of search engines and social media? And I'm wondering if I can piggyback on that.
Yeah.
Is it possible to imagine like a PBS or an NPR version of Google or
That's at
Facebook?
the end of my book.
Yeah.
Okay, so yes, of course, there is. I think we have, in the book, I talk about public interest search. Like, what would it mean if we had these kind of publicly funded, curated by academic librarians and public librarians and other kinds of knowledge workers in our society who would do so much more to contextualize. I also have a whole thing at the end about search interfaces and like making the subjectivity of knowledge and information so much more apparent, because we do that in the university. I mean, we're really good at that. And the way search is thought of now in terms of like a rank order is part of like what we have to trouble, because of course no one's holding up the foamy finger that says like, we're number 1,339,000. No one's doing that. If you're like, if that's where you are in the rank, no one's seeing that. If you're number one, everyone's trusting that. So we have to reimagine the interfaces into knowledge and not a rank order, because that is problematic. So there's many ways to kind of reimagine search. And, I write about that in the book, but I also think there's a whole new community of people who are doing what they call public interest technology. I think it's limited, but I think it's like, again, a frame that, what we don't want is just public interest technology that uses the same models, but instead it's run by the government, because that's not quite it. We also want to decolonize these projects so that they aren't just the same like actors that are participating in the knowledge organization and information organization. And that's one of the things that, if we start talking about decolonizing the internet, which is really like a whole different lecture, but I will say there's a lot of interesting energy that's happening right now around those conversations too, which might then throw into question the validity of something like search. Like maybe search should just be a commercial project and we understand it like it's going through the Sears catalog or some catalog or something that we saw when we were kids, and we understand it as like a sales book and not a knowledge machine. And if we disambiguated that, we'd actually maybe return to different ways of thinking, like the difference between fast food and slow food, right? The difference between fast food and organic, like the difference between a search for shopping and the library or other types of, archives, museums, oral histories, traditions, knowledge systems, sacred systems for other ways of knowing. And we would honor and make space for more of that, which I think search right now has kind of totalized the knowledge environment.
Well, I think one of the most powerful sentences in your book that really stuck with me is people think that Google is an information technology, but it's really an advertising technology.
Absolutely.
And it sort of condenses everything that's most worrying right there. I'm going to pick one more question, even though we're about to run out of time here. The question, and my apologies to all the other people who sent in great questions that didn't get read out. A lot of people say they care about technology and social issues, but they don't engage, they don't protest. How did past social movements engage that 10%? How do we engage the 10% today? So if I can rephrase it a bit, is it possible to imagine, a demonstration outside Google? Is it possible to imagine, people demanding that Google be regulated in a different way or that it change its algorithms? The way we've seen people take to the streets around Black Lives Matter and stuff like that.
I mean, some of the most powerful protests of Google have come from inside, from their own workers who have refused, for example, to put their labor in service of drone technology. I know you know this very well, and other types of dangerous tech. I think that it's possible that people will organize in the streets, although it's harder because people don't have the same visceral response to technology the way they do to, let's say, murdering unarmed people, or that's not the same thing. I think that we could think of a different model of protest, like the way we think about things like nuclear proliferation. So I think of AI proliferation up against models more like how do we stop? Now, everyday people did not really get in the streets about nuclear proliferation, but are extremely aware that nuclear weapons are dangerous and have very strong opinions about it, and will back people into public office who are not about nuking us. So I think we need more language and metaphors like nuclear proliferation and AI proliferation to help frame the scale and magnitude of the danger and the level of containment that needs to happen around these technologies. And that seems like a reasonable way to talk about it. The other part is just the environmental. We have movements underway that are very important, like environmental justice movements. And the tech industry is so deeply implicated in environmental injustice around the world. And this is where I point to people like Emily Bender, professor from University of Washington, her incredible paper, Stochastic Parrots, and her work is just, please look her up and read about her. There's going to be a new feature about her in New York Magazine coming out in the next few days. She's so smart and so brilliant. And one of the things that I think is interesting is she talks about the incredible drain on the environment and the climate from large-scale language modeling and these kinds of projects. They are deep, they consume so much energy. It's such a gross use of resources. So we can also attach these conversations to things that are underway that we care about and that we know we actually, even if you think that you're going to go into your bunker, like in New Zealand or whatever, like all the rich tech guys are doing, that's not going to save you. So if there's not a planet, there's not going to be a planet for anyone. So this actually makes the world smaller and makes these conversations smaller and puts us in a more, I think, a stronger position of power. So even if you don't care about the atrocities against people of color, against Black people and Indigenous people, against women, the repeal of civil rights for women, all of the things that are happening, maybe you will care about whether your kids have a planet to live on. I mean, there's got to be something in here for someone to care about, and these conversations are part of those.
Safiya Noble, it's been such an honor to be in conversation with you.
I feel the same with you. Thank you. Thank you. Appreciate you.
If this were a rock concert, you'd have to come back and do 2 or 3 encores. I feel as if we could keep going for another hour, and I'm sorry that we can't.
Same.
But I just want to say, before we all leave, I want to thank Phil Lind yet again for his generosity in making this possible. And I want to say a big thank you to our wonderful team of volunteers and the staff members at the School of Public Policy and Global Affairs and the Alumni and Development Office who worked tirelessly to make this series happen. Your hard work is really appreciated.
Thank you.
And last but not least, thank you to our audience. We hope you enjoyed the event, and it's offered you a new lens on civil and uncivil discourse. Please follow us, visit our website for more details on upcoming events. I hope this has whetted your appetite to come back for our next event, which will be on March 23rd with Pulitzer Prize-winning author Linda Greenhouse. So I hope we'll see you then. And please join me in thanking Safiya Noble once again.
Thank you, and thank you so much, Hugh. Thank you all.